Okay, so what is the line of action? Essentially, it's the flow of energy through the pose. Let's take a look at it. So here we have a reference image we got from Pinterest. So if I'm thinking about the line of action, I'm thinking about how can I capture or summarize the entire flow of energy through this pose. So I'm going to look at something along these lines, like that. You see, in that one line, we've captured essentially what's going on with that pose. So if we establish the line of action first and foremost, then we can build our gesture drawing on top of that. Let's try it. So here we have a new document. I'm going to first do my line of action. Now I can start to build my pose on top of it. Things I'm going to look at, for example, the tilt of the shoulders, tilt of the shoulders, tilt of the hips, and then we can do lightly draw in the face. So once I have my line of action in place, building the gesture on top of it is a little bit easier. Let's try it. So first I'm going to establish the angle of the shoulders and the hips. I'm going to exaggerate that just a little bit more here. Okay. And then typically I do a slight oval for these parts and the face. So once we've established the line of action, we can then start to build our gesture on top of it. Now with gesture, keep in mind, we're not trying to draw a well-developed figure. Our goal is not necessarily to draw the contour lines and get all the nuances prepared. Really, we're just looking at, okay, can we summarize the pose with a few lines? And typically we're using either the S curve, so it looks basically like an S. This is an S you're going to in writing. The S curve isn't trying to establish that, but just does the pose, as the pose changes and it flows, does it flow like an S or like a C? So those are typically the lines we're using. When it comes to gesture, we're not delving into a bunch of, when it comes to gesture, we're not using a lot of straight lines or anything that's stiff. It's going to be dynamic, tilts, and angles using the S line, S curve, or the C curve. All right, so let's try to tackle this gesture drawing. We'll give ourselves a time limit because the time limit kind of restricts your ability to overthink things. So it's a good practice to give yourself maybe a minute to 3 minutes or even 5 minutes or so, but just limit your amount of time that you're actually devoting to the gesture. That way you have to make decisions, very definitive decisions very quickly. Let's try it. I'm going to give myself set up here. I'll give myself just a minute. See what we can do in 1 minute. All right, let's go. First, we establish the angles of the shoulder and the hips. The torso. Gonna do the weight-bearing leg first. And then this leg, which kind of flows along with a line of action here. And up above, we will do her arms real quick. Here we have the shoulder. This is coming towards us a little bit more. We're going to emphasize it. And you can probably hear my alarm. That is our 1 minute. So I'll admit I made a few mistakes here. So when you look at the reference image, go back to my red marker. Look at the difference between her shoulder and her hip, right? So in our drawing here, the shoulder and hip, there's a much more narrow space there. Now, when we're doing our gesture, we want to definitely exaggerate those elements. However, we also have time to fix it. We had 1 minute to kind of capture it. And we did a decent job of just capturing the basic gesture. But if we want to really push it, we want to exaggerate. We can. One way to mitigate this is to exaggerate the line of action. Then when we do our first run through on our gesture, it's going to be much more accurate and much more dynamic. Let's try again. So with our next pose, we're going to focus again on establishing the line of action. So I'm thinking about again the flow from top to bottom. If I could capture it just in a snapshot, what would you see? So I think we're going to go for a big C curve here. Sometimes it's nice to try a couple of times to just get that flow. If you can capture with your whole arm, get that flow going. So we have a line that goes straight from all the way from. Sorry, we have a line that flows from her toes to the top of her fingertips. So now we're going to build our gesture drawing upon this line of action. Let's get into it. The first line of action. See, I changed my approach a little bit. It's a C curve with a slight S at the top of it. So one more time. Okay, so for a line of action, again, it flows from top to bottom. So once we have our line of action established, we're going to go in and now build our gesture on top of it. So I'm going to give myself 1 minute. Let's go. You can hear my alarm going off. I'm going to keep going just a little bit longer. Just going to finish this for you guys. Okay. So essentially, so again, we start with our line of action and we build our gesture on top of it. And you'll find that this approach really allows you to not, what I see a lot online is when people are doing their gesture drawing, they're simply very slowly and meticulously going through each point. Start with the head, the neck, the lumbar region, and it can work fine. That's a great approach. But if you want to have an energetic approach to your drawings, really make them dynamic and where you can feel the energy flow through them, line of action is your key. Once you've established that and you clearly mentally understand, okay, it's flowing from this part to this part. That's why I like to at the little arrow at the end of there. So I know like where's the energy flowing from and to. Once you have that established, really gesture drawing becomes so much easier, and it flows a lot more as well. So I'm happy with that one. I want to do one more to show you guys when you have a gesture, for example, when you have in the few examples we've looked at, we've seen when there is a very dynamic pose, right? But you may wonder, what about if you have a pretty, basic or stiff pose? Can you still use the line of action in that scenario? Let's take a look. I'll find out another one of my references. Again, Pinterest is a great resource if you're ever curious and want to find some good references, images. Pinterest. Let's make sure this looks okay. Okay. Okay, so now we'll go to the next one. So what is my line of action here? We have a very basic pose, right? The guy is standing it's from Three Musketeers. I'm a huge fan. Love this British version of the Three Musketeers story. Anyway, side note. So he's standing here. When a person's standing, we can often think, okay, that's a very, there's no flow there. There's no movement. That's not true. Even though a person is in a stationary pose, which means they're standing there, there's not any really movement going on, there's still subtle elements of movement here. So we still have a line of action. And that's because of something called contrapposto. What that means is counterbalance. So whenever you're standing there, typically one leg has more weight on it than the other one. Now what that does is kind of create a sense of flow through the figure. I'll demonstrate here. So here we have our figure. If we're looking at which leg bears the most weight, just take a look here on his right foot. How do we know this? Well, his hips are slightly tilted up. That's because the weight is bearing down on this side. So as you know, when you tilt to one direction, your hip will go up a little bit more. The shoulders are tilted this way. It's not an extreme tilt. And so if I'm looking for the line of action, it flows from this foot up there. It's subtle, and yet if we make sure that it's in our drawing, we do that same line of action, then our figure won't come across as stiff or just stationary with no flow or no movement. We want to make sure that it has that same sense of life to it. So let's try to draw this figure. We'll start off again with our line of action. Okay. The arrow. Okay, so we know the direction is going from the bottom up. Now I'm going to give myself 1 minute and see if we can kind of capture this pose. Setting up my timer here. Again, as a reminder, you don't have to time your poses or time your gesture drawings. The idea is that the less amount of time you have, the less amount of time you have to overthink things. You're just trying to quickly put down lines that summarize or capture the overall movement. That's why your line of action is so important to start off with. It gives you a clear focus. This is where it flows. Everything else, all the other lines would be built upon this trajectory to give our drawing life. Okay? All right, so 1 minute. Let's do it. Start out typically with my tilts, shoulder and hips. Weight bearing leg. Other leg here. Torso. Hips. Head. Our shoulders here. And again, with gestures, you can't do a whole lot in terms of, okay, that's 1 minute. You can probably hear it. Add a few more things here. These lines, these wrapping lines just kind of imply a little bit of perspective for our figure. Okay, there we have it. So in a few lines in 1 minute, we were able to still capture the basic pose. In it, we got our line of action first, as you can see here, the line of action. We know it starts, and sometimes you can even, I'll do it here just to demonstrate for you. You can even do like something like that. So you know that it starts here. This is where the weight is bearing down, and it goes and just flows through to the upper part of the figure. We don't have to do that, but you can if you like. And then upon that, we build our gesture. Again, throughout the entire gesture, you'll notice that what we're doing is using C curves, S curves. And another thing that we like to do to connect it all together is to have, there's like an overlap there. There's a flow. So if one line goes this way, the next one goes this way, the next one goes this way. It alternates back and forth, and that kind of also helps to generate that flow throughout the figure. We'll have another video on that later. So I want to demonstrate one more example of a pose that's kind of in between. It's a pose that implies dynamic movement and motion, and it's a very structurally stable pose. Let's take a look at it. So we have our figure here, and this person is clearly doing some CrossFit competition. Now we're looking at what would be the line of action here. Well, it's going to flow from the bottom up. This is our ground plane. It's going to flow through here. One more time, flow through here. So there's energy because she's picking up this giant boulder. And again, we want to get that arc in there. So this is going to be a basic C curve. There's going to be an arc in there. We can push the pose if we want to. So let me just demonstrate for you. So on my paper, my drawing, I can start out with something like this, which approximates the same basic flow that we see in the reference. Or we could push it a little bit further, something like this, or even like that. And so in each case, each arc that we're doing is going to generate more energy for the pose. So I think for this one, I'm just going to stick with we're going to keep it basic. This is going to be my basic line of action here. Now upon that, we're going to start drawing our gesture. So again, I'm going to give myself 1 minute. Let's get to it. Start out, of course, with the angle of the hip. Do our shoulder. Second arm here. Do wrapping lines here. I'm sure you can hear my alarm is going. So that was 1 minute. There you have it. Okay. So if you want to level up your gesture drawings and give them a much more dynamic, energetic feel, definitely focus on the line of action. And again, what is the line of action? Well, put simply, it's summarizing the entire movement into one flowing line. Like you see here, it either takes a C curve or an S curve. It shows where the energy is flowing. You can add an arrow to it if you like, if you want to kind of mentally give yourself a clear direction of where it's going, but you don't have to. And then upon that, you build your gesture. In our next video, we're going to break down the basic step-by-step process of gesture drawing. Until then, stay enthusiastically optimistic. This is Steven, signing off.